Have you ever had that moment when you're in conversation with someone and you mention something you've observed, something that seems so clearly evident to you, only to be met with a blank stare or uncomfortable silence? Perhaps you've noticed patterns in a relationship that others involved seem completely blind to, or recognize the underlying dynamics in a group that no one else acknowledges. Maybe you perceive the incongruence between what an institution claims to value and how it actually operates, or sense emotional currents running beneath the surface of casual interactions that others navigate without awareness. If these experiences resonate with you, you likely also notice something else. The more you share these perceptions, the more people tend to create distance between themselves and you. This distancing isn't random or meaningless. It reflects a fundamental aspect of human social dynamics that developmental psychologist Jean Piaget's work helps illuminate. When you perceive beyond conventional frameworks, you create cognitive dissonance for those operating within those frameworks. This dissonance feels threatening because it challenges not just specific ideas, but the very structures through which others organize and make meaning of their experience. The distance they create isn't personal rejection, but a natural protective response to the disequilibrium your perceptions create in their carefully constructed version of reality. Piaget revolutionized our understanding of cognitive development by recognizing that human beings don't simply accumulate more information as they mature. They actually transform how they organize and interpret experience. Each developmental stage represents a qualitatively different way of constructing reality, with new perceptual and cognitive capacities emerging that weren't available at previous stages. The expanded perception that allows you to see what others don't can be understood as an expression of more complex cognitive structures, ones that register dimensions of experience that conventional frameworks filter out or simplify. This isn't about being more or less intelligent in the traditional sense, but about having developed perceptual capacities that operate beyond the consensus reality that most social interaction depends upon. The challenge is that perception at this level creates fundamental disconnects in communication and shared meaning-making, leading to the distancing you experience when you express what you see. This distancing happens through several mechanisms. First, there's a basic incomprehension that occurs when you perceive through different cognitive structures than those around you. Piaget observed that children at different developmental stages literally cannot understand certain concepts because they haven't yet developed the cognitive frameworks needed to make sense of them. Similarly, when your perception has evolved beyond certain conventional boundaries, you may be seeing patterns, connections, or implications that others cannot recognize, not because they're not looking, but because their cognitive structures don't yet allow for that kind of perception. The disconnect isn't about willingness or effort, but about developmental capacity. When you try to communicate what you see to someone who lacks the frameworks to perceive it, you create confusion and discomfort rather than understanding. Second, there's a threat that expanded perception poses to established identity and worldview. Piaget described how cognitive development requires periods of disequilibrium, times when existing frameworks are challenged by experiences that can't be easily assimilated. This disequilibrium is necessary for growth, but also uncomfortable and sometimes threatening. When your perceptions challenge someone's established understanding of themselves, their relationships, or their social reality, you're essentially inviting them into disequilibrium they may not be ready for. The distance they create isn't just about avoiding a difficult conversation, but about protecting the coherence of their self-concept and worldview, structures that provide the stability and meaning most people depend upon for psychological security. I want to pause here and ask you directly, how has sharing your deeper perceptions affected your relationships? Have you noticed people creating distance when you express what you see clearly but they don't recognize? How have you navigated the choice between speaking your truth and maintaining comfortable connection? If you feel moved to share, please leave a comment below beginning with, "I've noticed distancing when," and tell us about your experience. Your story may help others recognize that the rejection they felt isn't personal failure, but a natural consequence of perception that exceeds conventional boundaries. I read every comment, and your experiences matter not just to me, but to our whole community of people learning to navigate the complexities of expanded awareness. The third mechanism of distancing involves what Piaget might recognize as the social enforcement of conventional schemas. He observed that cognitive development doesn't happen in isolation, but is profoundly influenced by social interaction and cultural context. The frameworks through which we interpret experience aren't purely individual constructions, but are shaped by collective agreements about what is real, important, or permissible to perceive. When your perception exceeds these collective agreements, you're not just thinking differently. You're actually violating implicit social contracts about what aspects of reality are acknowledged and which remain unspoken. This violation often triggers responses aimed at reestablishing the boundaries of acceptable perception, either by dismissing your observations as invalid or by removing you from the social context where your perceptions create disruption. This dynamic becomes particularly challenging in close relationships, where shared reality forms the foundation for intimacy and trust. When you consistently perceive dimensions of the relationship that your partner doesn't recognize or acknowledge, you create a perceptual gap that's difficult to bridge through ordinary communication. Your attempts to express what you see may be experienced not as helpful insights, but as criticism or projection. Your partner may feel unseen or misunderstood, not realizing that it's actually your capacity to see more deeply that's creating the disconnect. This misalignment often leads to a painful cycle where your attempts to create understanding through sharing your perceptions only widen the gap, leading to increasing distance despite your desire for closer connection. This pattern extends beyond personal relationships to broader social contexts. In work environments, for instance, your capacity to perceive underlying dynamics, unacknowledged conflicts, or systemic patterns may be experienced as threatening rather than valuable, particularly if these perceptions challenge established power structures or operational assumptions. You may find yourself marginalized or labeled as negative or not a team player, when you're simply perceiving and expressing realities that others prefer to keep below the threshold of collective awareness. In community or activist spaces, your recognition of complexities or contradictions may be unwelcome if they complicate straightforward narratives or challenge ideological cohesion. Even in spiritual or personal development contexts, your perception of inconsistencies or shadow elements may create distance if the group identity depends on maintaining certain perceptual boundaries. The distancing you experience isn't evidence of personal failure or social incompetence, but a predictable consequence of perception that exceeds conventional frameworks. Understanding this can help transform feelings of rejection or inadequacy into recognition of a developmental process that's unfolding naturally, if not always comfortably. Just as Piaget observed that cognitive growth involves necessary phases of disequilibrium and reorganization, the social disconnection that comes with expanded perception represents a transitional stage in the evolution of your consciousness, one that eventually leads not to permanent isolation, but to new forms of connection based on more authentic seeing and being seen. The path forward isn't about dimming your perception to maintain comfortable relationships, but about developing greater discernment in how you engage with what you see. This includes recognizing that not all perceptions need to be expressed in all contexts, not as a form of inauthenticity, but as an acknowledgement of developmental differences and relational realities. It includes developing more sophisticated communication skills that can translate your perceptions into forms that can be received by those operating from different frameworks. It includes finding or creating contexts where your way of seeing is valued and understood, Spaces where you don't have to contract your awareness to maintain connection. Most importantly, it includes cultivating compassion for both yourself and others navigating the complex territory of human perception and relationship. This compassion emerges from understanding what Piaget recognized so clearly, that cognitive development follows its own organic timeline and cannot be artificially accelerated. Just as we wouldn't expect a 6-year-old to grasp abstract mathematical concepts, regardless of how well they're explained, we cannot expect others to perceive beyond the developmental capacities they've currently developed. This doesn't mean your perceptions are wrong or that others are deficient. It simply acknowledges that consciousness evolves through stages that cannot be skipped or forced. When you understand the distancing you experience in this developmental context, it becomes less personal and more comprehensible, allowing you to hold your awareness with both conviction and humility. Holding this balance of conviction and humility represents a more advanced stage of development than either rigid certainty about your perceptions or self-doubt that dismisses what you clearly see. It aligns with what Piaget described as formal operational thinking, the capacity to think about thinking itself, to hold awareness of how you're constructing reality rather than simply being identified with your current construction. As this capacity develops, you become able to navigate the territory of expanded perception with greater flexibility and resilience, to communicate across developmental differences without compromising your own awareness, to find connection without contracting your consciousness to fit within conventional boundaries. If these reflections have touched something in your experience, if you felt that resonance that comes when someone puts words to what you've been living, I invite you to join our community of people navigating the sometimes challenging territory of expanded perception. By subscribing to this channel, you're connected with others who understand what it means to see beyond conventional boundaries, to hold awareness that creates both insight and sometimes distance in your relationships. Each video is created as an offering to those walking this path, providing perspectives and practices that might help you engage more effectively with both what you perceive and the social dynamics your perception creates. This isn't about building numbers, but about nurturing connections among those committed to authentic perception and expression, creating a field of mutual support for the evolution of consciousness. The distance that others create when you express what you see clearly, but they don't recognize, isn't the end of your story, but a chapter in a larger developmental journey. As your own consciousness continues to evolve, you'll discover ways of holding your expanded perception that create possibilities for connection rather than separation. You'll develop the capacity to translate between different perceptual frameworks, to find languages that can communicate across developmental differences, to create bridges of understanding where chasms of incomprehension once existed. This doesn't mean compromising the truth of what you perceive, but finding more effective ways to engage with that truth in relationship with others at different stages of perceptual development. This evolution parallels what Piaget observed in advanced cognitive development, the emergence of more integrated and flexible ways of organizing experience that can hold complexity without becoming rigid or dogmatic. As this integration develops, your expanded perception becomes not a barrier to connection, but a gift you bring to relationships, offering perspective that enriches rather than threatens shared understanding. You learn to hold awareness of multiple levels of reality simultaneously, to engage with both the surface dynamics that others perceive and the deeper currents that you recognize, to participate in conventional interactions while maintaining connection with your own deeper knowing. The relationships that emerge from this more integrated stance may be fewer in number, but greater in depth and authenticity than those based on shared limitations of perception. You'll find connections with others who either share your perceptual capacities or who, though operating from different frameworks, appreciate the perspective you offer even when they don't fully share your perception. These relationships provide the validation and reflection needed for a healthy development, creating contexts where your awareness can continue to evolve without the distortion that comes from persistent misalignment between what you perceive and what's reflected back to you by others. This doesn't mean the end of all relational challenges or the promise of perfect understanding. Even relationships between individuals with expanded perception involve navigating differences in how that perception is constructed and expressed. But it does mean the possibility of connection that doesn't require contraction of your awareness. Relationships where the fullness of your perception is received as contribution rather than threat. This possibility represents not just personal relief from the pain of isolation, but an evolutionary development in human consciousness itself. The emergence of new forms of relationship that can hold greater complexity and authenticity than conventional structures allow. As we continue to explore this territory together, remember that the distance others create in response to your expanded perception isn't a reflection of your worth or the validity of your awareness. It's a natural expression of developmental differences and the protective mechanisms that maintain psychological coherence at different stages of consciousness evolution. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the pain of disconnection, but places it in a meaningful context, transforming what might feel like personal rejection into recognition of your participation in the leading edge of human development. Your capacity to see what others don't yet recognize isn't a flaw to overcome or hide, but a gift to work with consciously, one that serves not just your individual growth, but our collective evolution toward more expanded and integrated ways of being human.